The air was thick with tension, as the sun beat down on the ancient stone of the royal palace. Inside the grand hall, the investiture ceremony was underway, a spectacle of pomp and pageantry, but for George it was a day of humiliation. He was forced to watch from the sidelines, his presence a mere afterthought. James, the king, had made it clear. George was not to take part, not when the presence of the volatile and powerful Carr could spark an incident. The real drama, however, was unfolding in the royal box. Sir Ralph Winwood, the king's secretary and a known ally of Carr, was seated next to George. Winwood, a veteran of Queen Elizabeth's court, had once been a key figure in shaping James's foreign policy, but now he was a man with a mission. He had seen the way Carr dominated the government, how he held the seals of office and controlled all foreign correspondence. Winwood had endured years of humiliation, doing everything in his power to win back his influence, only to be repeatedly snubbed by the young, arrogant favorite. As the ceremony progressed, George's eyes darted to Winwood, who looked tense and frustrated. The two men shared a moment of silent understanding. They both knew that the real power struggle was not on the stage below, but in this very room, where the court's most influential figures were watching and waiting. After the ceremony, the royal party began the annual summer progress, a journey through the countryside that was meant to bring the king closer to his people. It was a time of relaxation and pleasure, but for George and Winwood it was a chance to plot and gather information. The summer was unusually warm, and the fields were lush with ripe melons and grapes. The royal entourage moved through market towns and villages, their path lined with hedgerows and fields, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere of the court. One day, while the king and Carr were away, Winwood visited Mary Talbot, the Countess of Shrewsbury, who was imprisoned in the Tower of London. The Countess had a story to tell, one that could change everything. She spoke of Sir Thomas Overbury, a friend of Carr's who had been sent to the Tower 2 years ago. Overbury had died under suspicious circumstances, suffering from severe vomiting and thirst. The Countess claimed that the keeper of the Tower, Sir Gervase Elwes, had been involved in a plot to poison him. Winwood, sensing the gravity of the information, decided to investigate further. He met with Elwes at a dinner organized by the Countess's husband. Elwes, under pressure, admitted that he had been forced to poison Overbury on Carr's orders. The confession was a bombshell, and Winwood knew he had to act quickly. Meanwhile, the mood on the summer progress was beginning to shift. George maintained a calm and composed demeanor, but Carr was becoming increasingly insecure and demanding. The king, sensing the tension, ordered Sir Humphrey May, a skilled courtier, to mediate. May suggested that George should offer to become Carr's servant, a move that could defuse the situation. George, following May's advice, approached Carr and humbly offered his service. But Carr, driven by jealousy and pride, rejected the gesture outright. "I will have none of your service, and you shall none of my favor. I will, if I can, break your neck, and of that be confident," he spat. Carr's defiance only made the situation more volatile. He demanded a general pardon from the king, a move that raised eyebrows and suspicions. The Lord Chancellor, Thomas Egerton, refused to seal the pardon, citing the lack of precedent and the potential for abuse. The king, in a desperate attempt to protect Carr, summoned Prince Charles and placed a hand on his son's shoulder, declaring that the pardon was to ensure that Charles may not be able to undo that which I have done. The tension reached a boiling point at a meeting of the Privy Council. Carr, feeling cornered, confronted Egerton, demanding to know if he had any evidence against him. The king, in a bizarre and humiliating display, sided with Carr, but Egerton stood firm, refusing to seal the pardon. The king stormed out, but Egerton's refusal only added to the growing suspicions surrounding Carr. As the royal progress continued, the king and George grew closer. They arrived at Gotley, a property belonging to one of George's stepfathers, where they were entertained by the formidable Mary Villiers. The atmosphere was relaxed, and it was here that James and George's relationship took a deeper turn. In a bedchamber with a view of the rolling countryside, their bond was sealed, a moment that would define their future. The next stop was Farnham Castle, a picturesque palace set on a hill. It was here, amidst the beauty of the English countryside, that James and George's love affair was consummated. James, a man starved of affection and physical intimacy, found in George a source of comfort and companionship. George, with his charm and loyalty, provided the king with the emotional and physical support he desperately needed. Their relationship was intense, and George would later recall the significance of their time together, calling it a moment he would never forget. As the summer progress continued, the king and George's bond deepened. They shared meals, conversations, and moments of intimacy. The king, in his affection for George, showered him with gifts and favors, treating him like a son, a friend, and a lover. The relationship was complex, filled with tenderness and passion, a stark contrast to the cold and calculating world of the court. One of the most memorable moments of their early relationship was a hunt at Theobald's, the king's favorite hunting ground. It was a late-season hunt, and the stags were in rut, making the pursuit more dangerous. The king, a passionate hunter, wanted to share this experience with George, initiating him into the world of royal hunting. The hunt was a ritual of masculinity, a test of skill and courage. George, with his natural horsemanship and bravery, proved himself a worthy companion. The chase was intense, and the thrill of the hunt brought them closer, a bond forged in the heat of the moment. As the sun set on the hunt, the king and George rode back to the palace, their relationship stronger than ever. The summer progress was drawing to a close, but the drama of the court was far from over. The seeds of a power struggle had been sown, and the fate of the king's favorite was hanging in the balance. The hunt was a grand affair, full of tradition and ritual. The king, James, led the charge, and when the prey was finally brought down, the hunting party gathered around the fallen beast. James, with a swift and practiced hand, slit open the creature's belly and pulled out the steaming entrails. The dogs, eager and howling, were fed the warm guts. Then, to seal the bond, George, one of the king's closest friends, had his face smeared with the animal's blood, and the hunters, triumphant and ravenous, were given morsels of the still warm meat. While the countryside buzzed with the excitement of the hunt, London was a different kind of battleground. Sir Ralph Winwood, a powerful man at court, was on his own kind of hunt. His contacts in Holland revealed that a young apothecary had admitted to supplying poison to Robert Carr, one of the king's former favorites. When the court returned to London, Winwood presented his findings to James. The king's reaction wasn't recorded, but he took the accusations seriously. He referred the matter to his lawyers, and then withdrew to his retreat at Royston to await their decision. In May 1616, a trial was held, and both Carr and his wife, Frances, were found guilty. For Ralph Winwood, this should have been a moment of triumph. However, his earlier association with Carr made him suspicious, and the strain led to his illness and death the following year. Before Carr was sent to the Tower, he had a final meeting with the king. According to one account, Carr approached James with a petulant attitude, disagreeing with the verdict. The king, however, told him that the evidence was clear, and that even he would have accepted the verdict in similar circumstances. Another, more dramatic version claimed that Carr embraced and kissed the king, showing deep emotion, but then, with a smile, predicted he would never see the king again. Despite the fall of Carr, George's rise continued. He was made master of the horse, a prestigious position that Carr himself had failed to secure. This appointment showed that George had not only the king's favor, but also a talent for gaining power. However, his rise was not without its challenges. Rumors spread that he had caught smallpox, a disease that could have left his face scarred and ended his ambitions. The court, full of envious eyes, waited to see if he would fall. But George recovered, and soon he was rumored to be receiving the Order of the Garter, a high honor. The rumors were true, and George, along with the Earl of Rutland, was invested with the Garter, much to the surprise and dismay of many. Around this time, George's mentor, Sir John Graham, died. His funeral was a grand affair, with over 200 torches and many lords in attendance. Some saw the ceremony as pompous, and in Tothill Fields near Westminster, a group of men even mocked the event by performing a crude imitation with a dead dog. George's rise to power was not just a matter of luck. He was charming and knew how to navigate the complex world of the court. He was received with respect and surrounded by people eager to please him. But his position was also fragile. He had lost his mentor, and the former allies of Robert Carr were plotting his downfall. Even those who had helped him rise now expected him to do their bidding. One of George's new contacts was Francis Bacon, the king's attorney general. Bacon was a brilliant but controversial figure, known for his intelligence and his alleged involvement in scandalous activities. In a letter to George, Bacon shared some of his political wisdom. He advised George to be careful, not to appear too greedy, and to focus on building influence rather than just accumulating wealth. Bacon suggested that George should encourage able and virtuous men to join the king's council, rather than just those who were good at manipulating the system. He also warned George to be cautious with corrupt men, using them when necessary but keeping them at a distance. In August 1616, James decided to elevate George to the nobility. He gave him the estate of Wadden, worth a significant amount of money, and the title of Viscount Villiers. The ceremony was performed at Woodstock, a beautiful royal hunting lodge, with the Queen and Prince Charles as witnesses. George changed into a new outfit, a surcoat of crimson velvet, and returned to the king, who performed the ceremonies with great enthusiasm. The king's generosity continued, and George's portfolio grew. Despite rumors that George's favor was waning, the king's affection for him remained strong. In the new year of 1617, James gave George a miniature of himself, holding his heart, a romantic gesture that left no doubt about his feelings. Soon after, George was made Earl of Buckingham, and a few months later, at the young age of 24, he was appointed to the Privy Council, the youngest member ever. The king's love for George was not just a private matter. He openly declared his affection, even in front of his ministers. At a royal banquet, James read out verses he had written, expressing his deep love for George. The guests, though shocked, had to listen to the king's heartfelt words. James found in George and his family something he had never had before: a sense of family. George's mother, Mary, became a regular presence at court, and James encouraged the Queen to include her in her household. Mary worked tirelessly to advance her family, and soon George's younger brothers were also finding favor at court. The king's affection for George extended to his family, and Mary's influence grew. In this world of courtly politics, George's rise was nothing short of remarkable. He had the king's love, the support of a brilliant mentor like Bacon, and the loyalty of his family. But the court was a dangerous place, and George's position was always at risk. The king's love was strong, but the court was full of envious eyes, and the balance of power could shift at any moment. In June 1616, John, the eldest son of Mary and George, received a knighthood. This was a big deal, because John had been having a tough time. To make things even better, George decided to pass his titles and estates to John. This meant that John needed to get married quickly to secure the family's future. Mary, being the strong woman she was, took on the task of finding a wife for John. At the same time, King James was planning his first trip back to Scotland, since he became King of England in 1603. George was chosen to go with him, and Francis Bacon, a close friend of George, was left in charge of the government while the king was away. Bacon was excited about his new role and wrote to George, thanking him and promising to work hard for him. James and George left London on March 15, 1617. They traveled slowly, stopping at different estates along the way. They crossed the border into Scotland on May 13th and reached Edinburgh 3 days later. The city had been cleaned up and decorated to welcome the king, and everyone was excited to see him. However, James was nervous about going back to Scotland. He remembered the dangerous times he had there and was worried about how he would be received. Having George by his side helped calm him down. James made George a member of the Scottish Privy Council, which was a big honor. At the opening of the Scottish Parliament, James gave a speech where he talked about making Scotland more like England. He wanted the Scots to be more polite and cultured, but his words didn't go down well with everyone. Back in London, Bacon was enjoying his new role as the keeper of the seal. He was writing to George, telling him about his busy days and how much he missed him. Some people at court didn't like how Bacon was acting, thinking he was getting too full of himself. One day, a rumor reached London that George had died in Scotland. Bacon was devastated. He later found out it was just a mix-up, but it made him realize how important George was to him. Meanwhile, Mary was still trying to find a wife for John. She thought she found the perfect match, Frances, the 14-year-old daughter of Sir Edward Coke. But there was a problem. Sir Edward and his wife, Lady Hatton, didn't get along, and Lady Hatton didn't want her daughter to marry John because of his mental health issues. When Lady Hatton found out about the marriage plans, she took Frances and hid her. Sir Edward tried to find his daughter, and even broke down doors to get to her. Lady Hatton chased after him, and it turned into a big drama. Bacon got involved trying to help George, but he ended up making things worse. George was away in Scotland, and when he heard about the chaos, he was upset. He felt that Bacon had betrayed him by writing directly to the king about the marriage. George wrote to Bacon, telling him that he had been acting with scorn and neglect, and that he was disappointed. Bacon tried to make amends, but George was still angry. When James and George returned to London in September, Bacon waited outside George's bedchamber for 2 days, hoping for forgiveness. Finally, George let Bacon in, and Bacon fell to the ground, kissing George's feet. George helped him up, and things slowly started to get better between them. But the whole incident showed that George was growing into a powerful and savvy politician, and Bacon had to be careful not to cross him again. A few days later, George wrote to Bacon, his friend and mentor, to let him know that Bacon's apology had truly moved him. It had softened the hard feelings George had towards Bacon for his behavior when George was away. In a show of friendship, George told Bacon that he had even gone to King James to plead on his behalf. King James was still very upset with Bacon for his recent behavior, which had been somewhat childish and confusing. However, George had fallen to his knees and begged the king to spare Bacon from public disgrace. According to George, King James reluctantly agreed to give a general reprimand to all involved in the recent scandal, without naming Bacon specifically. Weldon, a keen observer of court life, noted how George's handling of Bacon had a profound effect. Bacon, once George's mentor, had become so subservient that he would not dare to refuse any command from George or his family, nor would he oppose anything they asked. Meanwhile, Frances Coke, the young woman at the center of the recent controversy, was persuaded to marry John Villiers, George's brother. Though it wasn't a marriage of love, Frances accepted it as a practical decision, recognizing that John was a suitable match. The wedding took place at Hampton Court on September 29, 1617, and King James gave the bride away, a gesture that showed his support for the union. Sir Edward Coke, Frances's father, was reinstated to the Privy Council, and George arranged a public reconciliation between his mother and Frances's mother at Cecil House. Lady Hatton, Frances's mother, hosted a grand event at her home in Holborn, where King James was a guest of honor. He knighted several of Lady Hatton's guests, and showed particular favor to George's mother, Lady Compton, and the rest of the Villiers family. The king praised and kissed them, and blessed those who wished them well. This event marked the rising influence of the Villiers family at court. However, George faced a new challenge. His older brother John's mental health had deteriorated to the point where their mother had to seek medical help. This situation made it urgent for George to find a suitable heir for his titles and estates. Though it was risky for a favorite to marry, as it could provoke the king's jealousy, George needed a wife to secure his legacy. George chose Katherine, the daughter of Francis Manners, the 6th Earl of Rutland, as his bride. Despite her noble background, she wasn't the obvious choice for a man of George's status. Portraits of Katherine show a lively and intelligent face, but one that didn't conform to the conventional standards of beauty. There were also financial and religious obstacles. The dowry demanded by George's mother was considered too high, and Katherine's family was known to be Catholic, which could cause controversy at the Protestant-dominated court. The biggest obstacle was Katherine's father, the Earl of Rutland. He resented George's rise to power and tried to prevent the marriage by keeping George and Katherine apart, but George was persistent. He had a personal connection to the Manners family, as they were from his home county, and he had grown up in the shadow of their ancestral home, Belvoir Castle. His mother, Mary, played a crucial role in breaking the deadlock. She invited Katherine to supper at her house in Chelsea, and George joined them. The next day, when Mary returned Katherine to her father, he refused to take her back, forcing her to stay with an uncle. The Earl then wrote a furious letter to George, accusing him of dishonoring his daughter. George responded with a letter expressing his surprise and indignation, claiming that Katherine's honor had been only by her father's words. He stated that he would leave off pursuing Katherine, giving the Earl the choice to marry her to someone else. The Earl's resistance was broken, and he agreed to the marriage. They were wed in a private ceremony in London, with the Earl in attendance and a dowry of £10,000 in cash, and estates worth £4,000 to £5,000 a year. Katherine proved to be an excellent choice. She brought George closer to King James, who treated her like a daughter rather than a rival. They developed a close and playful relationship, often writing to each other and fussing over each other's health. To celebrate their marriage, King James commissioned a portrait of George and Katherine by the Dutch artist Van Dyck. The painting, titled Venus and Adonis, subverted the traditional roles. George is depicted as a strong and desirable figure, while Katherine is shown in a less flattering light. This portrait highlighted why James was infatuated with George, and why Katherine could be a loyal companion without being a rival for the king's affections. George used Katherine's dowry to buy Burley on the Hill, a property near the Earl of Rutland's estates. The king was invited to the housewarming, where he toasted George's health and playfully speculated on who loved George the most. He even wrote a poem expressing his hope for a smiling boy to be born soon. Following the marriage, James wrote a letter to George and Katherine, wishing them a happy morning and blessing their union. He expressed his hope that they would have children, whom he looked forward to playing with. When their first child, Mary, was born in 1622, James nicknamed her Mal and referred to her as his grandchild. The king was delighted to see George's family grow, and the court was often filled with George's children, whom James affectionately described as dancing like fairies through the privy lodgings. George's rise continued as he cultivated a network of loyal clients and dependents. He was generous to those who supported him and harsh on those who opposed him. One physician who crossed George noted that while he could manage his affections with serenity, once crossed, he sought revenge. In the late 1610s, a scandalous Latin book titled Corona Regia, or Royal Crown, began circulating in London. It appeared to be an official publication by the respected scholar Isaac Casaubon, but it was a scathing attack on King James. The book accused the king of hiding his true nature and engaging in secret and immoral activities, including relationships with both men and women. It listed James's favorites, including George, and suggested that the king's generosity was directed at those who served him personally rather than the kingdom. The book caused a stir, and the government ordered an investigation. The king demanded justice, but efforts to suppress the book were unsuccessful. The scandal only added to the growing discontent at court, where some began to criticize the king's favoritism, particularly towards George and his family. Rumors and poems critical of the king and George spread through London. One poem, quoted by John Chamberlain, mocked the king and George's family, listing the various members who had benefited from George's influence. The poem suggested that the court was filled with George's relatives, who had secured positions and monopolies through their connections. George's rise to power had revealed deep corruption at the heart of the court. He had arranged for his relatives to receive various monopolies and positions, including a patent for licensing inns and a monopoly on gold and silver thread. These actions only fueled the growing criticism and resentment towards him. Despite the advice of his mentor Bacon to be careful, George's actions were coming under increasing scrutiny, and the consequences were beginning to show. The winter of 1621 was a time of stark contrasts in London. While Sir Francis Bacon and his guests were warm and merry at a grand banquet at York House, the city outside was gripped by a harsh frost. Snow and ice piled up like mountains, the Thames froze over, and the people faced shortages and soaring food prices. The country was also feeling the strain of the 30 Years' War, which was disrupting trade and causing economic pain. King James I, who had been spending lavishly since he took the throne in 1603, found himself in a financial crisis. His attempts to raise money through various means, like selling titles and monopolies, had not been enough to cover his expenses. The only solution was to call a new parliament, hoping they would agree to new taxes. Bacon, as the king's representative, managed to secure a promise of 2 subsidies, but at a cost. The king had to agree to a parliamentary committee to investigate public grievances. This committee, led by Sir Edward Coke, quickly turned its attention to the king's favorites, especially George Villiers and his relatives. One of the first targets was Sir Giles Mompesson, who had been granted a monopoly over inn licenses. Mompesson's actions had caused widespread anger, and he was eventually forced to flee the country. The king, seeing the public outrage, had to disown Montpesson and revoke the monopoly. George's half-brother, Sir Edward Villiers, made a bad decision by trying to enforce a monopoly on gold and silver thread, which led to thread makers being imprisoned. This sparked protests, and George had to distance himself from his brother to save his own position. He even asked the king to dismiss Parliament, but James, desperate for the tax revenue, refused. In a dramatic move, King James appeared in the House of Lords to defend George, describing him as poor George Villiers, and asking the Lords to judge him as a man, not a favorite. George, kneeling before the king, promised to clear his name or accept the consequences. This show of loyalty and humility seemed to work, and the focus of the parliamentary investigations shifted away from George. However, the next target was Sir Francis Bacon. Charges of corruption and bribery were brought against him, and the House of Commons voted to break off all other business to investigate. Bacon, who had been at the height of his power, found himself facing impeachment. King James, realizing the gravity of the situation, signaled that he was willing to sacrifice Bacon for the public good. By April 1621, Bacon's fall from grace was complete, and he wrote his will. Some people believed that George would protect Bacon, but it seemed that the king had made it clear to Bacon that he should submit to his peers to save George from a similar fate. The satirists and poets of the time used the image of a hunt to describe the situation, with Bacon as the boar and George as the buck. The message was clear: in the game of power, the fastest and most cunning would survive, and Bacon was about to be caught. As the chapter closes, George Villiers, once the king's favorite, had managed to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics. George's survival in this dangerous world would depend on his ability to stay ahead of his enemies and maintain the king's favor. The game was far from over, and the next move could mean everything.